This conference brings together people from India, Brazil, and South Africa. And after centuries in which the West has lectured the South, we think it's about time that we in turn start asking what the global South can teach us. This is the time when cities are actually becoming the main sites of contestation, with highly visible popular occupations of Cairo's Tahrir Square, Istanbul's Gezi Park, New York City's Zuccotti Park, and so many more. It is in these struggles about the control of city spaces that popular struggles are being shaped. And in fact, these struggles share a lot across national boundaries. First, they are directed against displacement and poverty. And second, they fight for democracy and participation. These similarities are astonishing, given that the situation on the ground is so different in Cairo from, say, New York. The struggles are all demanding what the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre once called the right to the city. Demanding the right to the city is, at the same time, a strategic and an inherently progressive demand, because it is not only about individual liberty, or in the words of geographer David Harvey, we have gotten to a point where, quote, the right to the city is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. This is why the fight for the right to the city is a fight for a human right that in fact transcends the short-sightedness of the contemporary neoliberal regime and its austerity policies. Because if we want to break the grip of neoliberalism and austerity, we need to have vibrant social movements that build up pressure. But we also need to discuss how government or an alliance between movements and politics can make a difference, even under the hegemony of neoliberalism and austerity. In bringing together movement activists, progressive politicians, and academics, we want to explore the alternatives we have. For one thing we know, a situation where there is no alternative does not exist. Such a situation is the creation of neoliberal think tanks that want us to believe that the agenda of the large corporations is without any viable alternative. For now, and for the first time in human history, more people worldwide live in cities than in rural communities. So one thing is clear, the 21st century will be the century of the cities.
This evening and the coming 2 days, we are speaking more about the displacement crisis and the shocking levels of inadequacy of housing and living conditions. So let me just give you one example of the scale of this crisis. In India, recent work shows that by 2031, we are going to have 6 cities that are going to be more than 10 million population. So 41% of our population is going to be living in cities. But what does this actually mean? So we have this growing urbanization crisis, and at the same time, we have a colossal housing shortage. Our national housing shortage is around 27 million, And shockingly, 99% of this shortage is with the poor, with economically weaker sections. And of course, in the absence of affordable housing and low-cost housing, the majority of the poor live in slums. In the city that I come from, one of our municipalities has, in a study in 2010, stated that 49% of the city's population lives in slums, and only 5% live in what we can call planned areas, areas that are zoned, that are fully serviced. There's another study that estimates that it's much more, it's 50 to 55% that in Delhi that live in the slums. So this kind of a crisis, we need to ask the question, what does it actually mean in human terms? And when we have this kind of a crisis, what is the impact of that? And why is it that the crisis of more and more people having to live in inadequate and insecure conditions, more and more people becoming homeless, why is this increasing? One of the reasons is evictions. We have seen a significant rise in the number of people being displaced from their homes for a range of reasons, all of them involving gross violations of human rights. And these evictions are taking place in cities, in countries that have, it doesn't matter what type of government you have, an authoritarian government, democratic government. And many are happening because of development, in the name of development. So we have evictions, slum clearance drives, large-scale infrastructure, urban renewal, housing renovation. You see here as well, gentrification. And again, shockingly, recent work that has been done shows that, and I'm including in this the rural evictions from rural areas because of large-scale dams and mega projects, that the number of people being displaced annually across the world because of so-called development and market. And also, it's very important to understand the impact of evictions from a discrimination perspective, because discrimination plays, as we have seen in studies around the world, a critical role in forced evictions cases. Ethnic, religious, racial, and other minorities, as well as indigenous people, are far more likely to be affected. Women suffer particularly as a result of forced evictions, and as a consequence not just of loss from the home, but also livelihoods, relationships, and support systems that women are used to, breakdown of kinship ties, physical and psychological trauma, and even increased morbidity and mortality. And of serious consequence is the fact that evictions increase the vulnerability of women to further acts of violence. When we had the economic crisis, what we could have done is we could have regulated the market, controlled speculation, built social housing, strengthened rental legislation, regulated banks and mortgages, addressed the issues of subsidies in housing and civic services for the vulnerable, and created a range of housing options, not just shelters and ownership housing, but a range of options in between, what is often referred to as the continuum of housing. Instead of that, what did we get? We got deregulation, further deregulation of the real estate sector, weakening of rent control, no control on mortgage practices, increased demolition of public housing, including in this country, reduction of subsidies, increase in the tenure of mortgage loans. You have 40-year mortgages in some countries. The growth of what were there, but there's been a significant growth of land cartels and land mafias. And then, of course, a continued obsession in face of all evidence with home ownership. And the institutionalization of neoliberal policies, including through increasing privatization of civic services, has led to deepening inequalities of income and opportunity between and within cities. But what has not happened is there hasn't been a link made between the right to the city and human rights. So what does we say the right to the city, but what does it actually mean in human rights terms? So I would argue that the concept of the right to the city, and particularly its implementation, needs to be grounded in basic human rights principles of non-discrimination, indivisible human rights, gender equality, progressive realization, non-retrogression, and a range of other fundamental basic human rights principles that collectively emphasize the fact that priority attention in all our cities needs to be given to persons and groups who are living in situations of vulnerability. And of course, this has already been recognized in the Right to the City statute in Brazil, where you have this very, very useful concept of designating areas where the poor people live as zones of social interest, and municipalities working to provide them security of tenure and provide them civic services and protection against forced evictions. But let me just quickly run through what these principles mean for the work on the right to the city. So the indivisibility of human rights, of course, calls for a simultaneous realization of all human rights for residents of the cities. That means all rights, civil, political, cultural, social, even environmental rights, must receive the same attention. The problems we've been facing in our cities is there has been a sort of a silo approach where cities focus on one or two rights, but they all need equal priority in city governance, planning, management, and implementation. And also the recognition along with this of individual rights, but also that the right to city is a collective right. It's not only for individuals, it's also for groups, particularly groups that are vulnerable, as I mentioned. And the issue of non-discrimination and inclusion is a very, very strong principle that these rights in the city must be guaranteed to all women, men, youth, and children who choose to make the city of their home, irrespective of their economic status, their identity, their caste, sexual affiliation, and so forth. And of course, inclusion in an urban context also means inclusive models of city planning and development, as well as the sort of deliberate creation of mixed income and mixed class neighborhoods to prevent social segregation, gentrification, and social apartheid. And this would also include the need to ensure that poor and homeless must not be criminalized and subjected to forms of abuse and violence by the state and its machinery, particularly the police. And there's a very urgent need, and this is slowly happening, of removing anti-vagrancy and anti-beggary laws that, in order to recognize, as I was mentioning the issue of city makers in India, to recognize the contributions of the working poor to the city economy. And as a movement, it could help to articulate and realize the model of an alternative city that is grounded in human rights and based on equality, inclusion, mutual respect, tolerance, freedom, and social justice. So essentially, the message that I would like to give is that we need to all work collectively to recover the human rights paradigm with the aim of creating cities, towns, and villages where all residents, regardless of income levels, class, or race, have the human right to all the opportunities that are available without distinction or discrimination. Thank you very much.